The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, laughter, and glass. It was the night of the Coleman-Avery merger, a deal worth over $1 billion, and the city's elite had gathered to celebrate. In the center stood Victoria Coleman, wife of billionaire investor Charles Coleman, tall, elegant, draped in diamonds. She carried her wine glass like a weapon. At the far end of the room, the new CEO, Derek Hayes, a brilliant black entrepreneur who had saved Coleman Industries from collapse, was speaking with a few partners. He was confident, calm, and respected. But not everyone liked seeing him at the top. When Victoria saw him, her smile stiffened. She whispered to her husband, loud enough for others to hear, "It still feels strange, doesn't it? Someone like him running the company?" Charles laughed nervously, unsure what to say. The investors noticed. Derek did too. The air tightened, and Victoria, feeling eyes on her, decided to make a statement. A waiter passed, and Victoria glided toward Derek, her heels sharp on the marble floor. "Mr. Hayes," she said with a polished smile, "you must be proud of yourself." Derek nodded respectfully. "I'm proud of the team, ma'am. It's been an honor to rebuild what was broken." Her smile thinned. "Oh, I'm sure. Though some things can't be rebuilt, not with money." And before anyone could react, she tilted her glass and poured red wine down his suit. The crowd gasped. The wine soaked his white shirt, dripping onto the marble like spilled blood. For a moment, time froze. Victoria smirked. "Oh dear, I'm so clumsy." Derek looked at her, not with anger, but with quiet dignity. He took a handkerchief, wiped his face, and said calmly, "Accidents reveal character. Mrs. Coleman, thank you for the reminder." Then he walked away, while every camera in the room silently captured the moment. Within an hour, social media had exploded. Videos of the wine incident spread like wildfire. Wine and wounds, arc respect. Has no color. Coleman scandal by morning. Headlines screamed, "Billionaire's wife humiliates black CEO at charity gala." Derek said nothing publicly. He simply returned to work, focused, composed, unstoppable. Meanwhile, Victoria's phone buzzed endlessly. Reporters, threats, outrage. Charles tried to do damage control, calling investors and apologizing, but something had already changed. When Derek walked into the boardroom the next day, a dozen executives rose in silent support. The balance of power was shifting, quietly. Inevitably, that night in his penthouse office, Charles Coleman made a call to Tokyo, the final step to close the billion-dollar merger, but something was wrong. "Mr. Coleman," the Japanese investor said sternly, "we saw the video. We do not work with companies that disrespect integrity." Charles froze. "It was my wife. Your wife represents your values," the voice replied coldly. "The deal is off." Click, one sentence, one act. $1 billion vanished into thin air. Charles stared out the window, trembling. His empire, his pride, undone by a glass of wine. 2 days later, Derek called a press conference. Cameras flashed as he stood before reporters in a clean gray suit. "I was humiliated," he said. "But this is not about me. It's about what respect looks like. In boardrooms, in society, in humanity." He paused, looked straight into the camera. "We can't build the future if we're still pouring the past on each other." The crowd fell silent. Even those who once doubted him stood in quiet awe. Somewhere across town, Victoria watched the broadcast, her face pale, her glass trembling. She had poured the wine, but it was her family who ended up drowning in its stain. Morning light crept through the tall glass windows of the Coleman mansion, but inside, everything was dark. Charles sat in his home office, surrounded by silent phones, unopened emails, and unanswered calls. A week ago, he was the face of confidence. Now he was the face of scandal. Investors were backing out. Banks wanted answers. Partners were distancing themselves. On the news, anchors debated whether Coleman Industries could survive the wine scandal. "It's unbelievable," one commentator said. "$1 billion merger lost. Not by business failure, but moral arrogance." Charles turned off the TV. He rubbed his temples. All of this because of you, he muttered under his breath. From the hallway, Victoria's voice echoed, trembling with anger and disbelief. Don't blame me, Charles. He made a scene. He wanted this. No, Victoria, he said coldly. You wanted it, and now we're the scene. The tabloids devoured the story. Photos of Victoria at galas, smiling with champagne, were plastered with mocking headlines. Queen of Cruelty. The billionaire's wife who cost $1 billion. Protesters gathered outside their mansion gates with signs reading, "Respect is priceless. No more humiliation disguised as class." Their daughter, Emily, a quiet university student, came home in tears. "Mom, people filmed me at school. They called me racist royalty." Victoria's face went pale. The consequences were no longer just financial. They were generational. That night, she looked out the window and saw reporters camped outside like vultures. For the first time, she realized that power could vanish faster than a glass could spill. Meanwhile, Derek Hayes stayed silent. He refused interviews, ignored gossip shows, and kept working. But his silence only made the world listen harder. Across the city, talk shows called him the man who didn't retaliate. Students quoted his press speech and essays about dignity. Even the mayor called to commend his restraint. Inside his minimalist office, Derek stood before a photo of his late mother, a nurse who taught him that real strength comes from quiet endurance. "You told me, Mom," he whispered. "Someday people will see what respect truly means." He didn't need revenge. The world was doing it for him, one headline at a time. Victoria tried to act normal. Dinners continued silently. Servants avoided her eyes. Charles barely spoke. One evening, she opened a letter from the board of directors. Her hands shook as she read, "Effective immediately, Derek Hayes has been appointed chairman of Coleman Industries." The paper slipped from her hand. "They can't do this. Charles cut her off, voice trembling with anger and defeat. "He's the only one they trust now. You gave him the crown with that glass." Victoria's lip quivered. "You're choosing him over your own wife." "No," he said, his eyes hollow. "I'm choosing survival over pride." Outside, thunder rolled, the kind of storm that didn't cleanse but buried. Weeks later, Derek finally agreed to one interview, live, global, and unscripted. The world watched. The interviewer asked gently, "Do you forgive them?" Derek smiled faintly. "Forgiveness isn't about excusing the act. It's about freeing the heart from hatred." "Would you ever work with them again?" He paused, then looked straight into the camera. "If they learn what respect means, not through wealth, but through loss, maybe." That single line became a viral quote. Posters, reels, and speeches echoed his words. And far away, in the dark of her living room, Victoria watched the screen, her reflection split by the TV's glow. For the first time, she felt something she had never felt before. Shame. The next board meeting began without the usual luxury. No champagne, no velvet chairs, just silence. And an empty seat at the head of the table. That seat had once belonged to Charles Coleman. Now it sat open as Derek Hayes entered. Calm, steady, eyes firm. Every executive rose to their feet. Even the ones who once doubted him. "Let's begin," Derek said quietly. The new leadership meeting wasn't about expansion or wealth. It was about rebuilding trust, not with investors, but with the people. He ordered new ethics programs, scholarships, diversity initiatives. Coleman Industries would now invest in people, not just profit. From her home, Victoria watched the press conference. The same room where she'd humiliated him now carried his name on the podium. And when Derek spoke about integrity over image, she realized he wasn't trying to destroy them. He was showing them what real power looked like. Charles spent most days drinking in silence. His empire was now run by the man his wife had tried to humiliate. Victoria approached him one night. "Charles, we can fix this. We can apologize publicly." He looked up slowly. "You can. But I can't. Because deep down, I knew who you were. And I let you do it. Those words cut deeper than any headline. Victoria turned away, eyes glassy. The mansion that once echoed with applause now hummed with emptiness. In her vanity mirror, she saw herself, not the diamond-clad woman of status, but a lonely reflection of arrogance and loss. She whispered to her reflection, "What have I done?" And for the first time in her life, she didn't recognize the woman staring back. A week later, a letter arrived at the Coleman mansion, simple, white, and unsigned. Victoria opened it. True remorse isn't spoken, it's lived. If you ever wish to understand humility, visit the shelter on 8th Street. Ask for Grace, there was no signature, but she knew who sent it. The next day, she arrived at the shelter. The building was old, but filled with life, volunteers serving food, children laughing, hope in motion, and there, among them, stood Derek Hayes, serving meals with a smile. When their eyes met, she froze. "You came," he said simply. I had to see what you built." "No," he said quietly. "I didn't build this." "People did. The ones you never saw." Victoria felt something heavy inside her crumble. She took a serving spoon, trembling, and for the first time she served others instead of herself. It started as a whisper, then a rumor, then a storm. Someone filmed Victoria at the shelter, serving food beside Derek. The internet exploded again. But this time, the headlines were different. Billionaire's wife seen working at homeless shelter. From scandal to service, has Victoria Coleman changed? For days, she avoided reading the comments. She didn't do it for redemption. She did it because, for the first time, she felt peace. But one comment under the video caught her attention. It's not about where she is now. It's about who she was brave enough to face. That night, she cried. Not for the billion lost, but for the years wasted believing she was above others. Weeks passed. Victoria kept volunteering, quiet, humble, learning. She often helped a woman named Grace, kind, calm, and wise. One day, Victoria asked, "How long have you been working here?" Grace smiled. "Since my son started it." "Your son?" Grace nodded. "Yes, Derek Hayes." Victoria froze. Grace continued softly. "When he was young, people treated him like he didn't belong. But he always said, 'One day I'll build a place where everyone belongs.'" Tears welled in Victoria's eyes. She turned away, ashamed, realizing that the woman beside her, humble, graceful, was the mother of the man she'd tried to humiliate. And yet Grace had never judged her. She had only shown kindness. At that moment, Victoria finally understood the meaning of Derek's letter. True remorse wasn't about saying sorry. It was about serving where you once stood tall. A month had passed since Victoria began serving at the shelter. No cameras, no headlines, just quiet work and quiet change. Then one morning, a journalist approached Derek with a hesitant smile. "Mr. Hayes, people are talking. They say the woman who once humiliated you now serves food beside you every night. Why let her?" Derek replied simply, "Because change can't happen in isolation. Sometimes the ones who hurt us the most are the ones who need grace the most." The story spread across the nation, not as scandal, but as inspiration. Articles read, "From arrogance to empathy, the woman who learned humanity." And for once, the comments weren't cruel. People were moved. At the shelter, Victoria tried to hide from the attention, but Grace put a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let them see, child," she whispered. The world needs to see what humility looks like. Charles Coleman sat alone in his study, the walls lined with forgotten awards. His empire was gone, sold off piece by piece. Derek now ran what was left, but even he refused to gloat. When Victoria returned home that evening, Charles barely looked up. "So, now you serve soup instead of wine?" He muttered bitterly. "Yes," she said softly. "And for the first time I feel full." Charles laughed, hollow, painful. "You think this redeems you?" "It's not redemption I'm looking for," she said. "It's restoration of the person I lost when I believed I was better than others." He stared at her for a long time. For the first time, he saw something real, not the cold, polished wife he knew, but a woman transformed by truth, and though he couldn't say it aloud, he envied her peace. Months later, Coleman Industries, now rebranded as Hayes Global, hosted a charity gala to fund schools and shelters. Derek stood on stage in a simple black suit, speaking not of money, but of meaning. Success means nothing if it doesn't lift others with it. As the crowd applauded, he noticed Victoria standing quietly in the back, not in diamonds, but in a plain blue dress, holding Grace's hand. When the time came for him to thank the contributors, Derek paused. "There's one person here tonight who taught us all a painful but powerful lesson. Mrs. Victoria Coleman, please join me on stage." The room went still. Victoria froze. Her heart pounded. She walked slowly, every step a lifetime. When she reached him, Derek extended his hand. "You showed the world that respect is learned, sometimes the hard way. Thank you for showing that change is possible." Applause filled the room, not mockery, but forgiveness. And as she shook his hand, tears streamed down her face. For the first time, she felt light. The next morning, Charles visited the shelter for the first time. He stood awkwardly in the doorway, watching his wife serve breakfast beside Derek and Grace. Grace smiled warmly. "You must be the man behind the woman," she said gently. Charles looked down. "No, ma'am. I was the man behind her mistakes." Grace touched his arm. "Then perhaps you can stand beside her now." Derek approached and extended his hand. "There's room for everyone here, Mr. Coleman." Charles hesitated, then slowly took it. And in that single handshake, a lifetime of pride dissolved into something greater: respect. Weeks later, Derek unveiled his newest project, the Bridge Initiative, a nationwide effort to rebuild trust between corporations and communities. Victoria and Charles stood among the crowd as he spoke. "We can't erase the past," Derek said, "but we can use its ashes to light the way forward." The audience rose in applause. As the lights dimmed, Victoria turned to Charles and whispered, "We lost everything that money could buy, but we found everything it couldn't." He nodded slowly. "Maybe this is what real wealth feels like." In the crowd, Grace smiled quietly, her eyes full of pride. And Derek looked up at the ceiling lights, bright, hopeful, endless, as if speaking to his mother silently. We rose not by winning, but by forgiving. 6 months had passed since the gala. The world had moved on, but the people touched by the story had not. One morning, Derek received a letter with a faint golden seal, Coleman Foundation. Inside, a simple note in Victoria's handwriting read, "To rebuild what arrogance destroyed, we must start with education." Attached was a donation, $10 million, anonymously directed toward scholarships for underprivileged youth. Derek stared at it for a long time. He knew Victoria didn't want recognition. This wasn't about her image. It was about healing the world she once looked down on. He smiled softly. Now that's power. Weeks later, Grace, the heart of the shelter, fell ill. Derek rushed to her side, holding her frail hands. "Don't you dare leave me now," he whispered, voice breaking. She smiled faintly. "I'm not leaving, child. I'm passing it on." "Passing what?" "The work, the love, the bridge you built between two worlds that never spoke." Tears rolled down his cheeks. "I'm not ready." "You never are," she whispered. "But the world is." That night she passed peacefully, leaving behind a note that simply read, "Forgive faster, love louder." At her funeral, Victoria and Charles stood beside Derek. No titles, no money, no pride. Just humans, bound by loss, love, and change. A year later, a new building stood tall in downtown Atlanta, Grace Coleman Academy for underprivileged youth. It was founded jointly by Derek Hayes and the Colemans. On the entrance plaque read, "Where respect is the foundation and forgiveness is the curriculum." At the opening ceremony, children in simple uniforms recited poems about kindness and hope. Derek stood at the podium, his voice steady but full of emotion. This school isn't about the past. It's about the people who refuse to let pain define them. It's about what happens when forgiveness becomes the richest currency. Victoria watched from the front row, tears in her eyes, hand in Charles's. They had fallen from power, but risen in purpose. After the ceremony, Derek and Victoria sat under the oak tree outside the school, the same kind of tree that once shaded his mother's grave. "I never imagined we'd end up here," Victoria said quietly. "Neither did I," Derek replied. "But maybe this was always where we were supposed to be. Do you forgive me?" He looked at her, eyes soft. "I already did." "The moment you chose to change." A tear rolled down her cheek. Not of guilt, but of peace. "You taught me something no business ever could," she whispered. Respect isn't earned by wealth. It's earned by how you treat those who have none. They sat in silence, the kind that speaks louder than words. Years later, the world remembered the name Derek Hayes not as a CEO, but as a man who turned humiliation into humanity. Under his leadership, the Bridge Initiative and Grace Coleman Academy expanded across the nation. Thousands of young people found opportunity, dignity, and self-worth. And every year, Derek visited the shelter where it all began. He'd pour 2 cups of coffee, one for himself, one for Grace, and sit in quiet reflection. One evening, as the sunset cast gold across the city skyline, a young volunteer approached him. "Mr. Hayes, why do you still come here?" He smiled. "Because every empire built on kindness never falls." The camera pans up, the city glowing, the laughter of children echoing through the streets. And on the wall behind him, engraved in stone, read Grace's final words. "Forgive faster. Love louder.